Everyone is chasing after something. Some of us even know what it is. The problem is that we may be chasing after the wrong things, and we only discover that when it's too late. This week, we're going to be asking the question, why is it that lust draws us away from what is good and right? Why do we go chasing after the wrong things? Wanderlust is the sermon for this Sunday.
Did you hear about it? How could he be so careless? His reputation ruined, his career ended when we heard about the affairs, the abuse, the betrayal. Who am I talking about? Maybe you're thinking about a famous politician or performer or player or preacher. Maybe you're thinking about somebody in all four categories. It's incredible to me that when we think about folks who have fallen from great heights, stories like that seem almost routine. We could rightly ask a lot of questions, but one question we don't need to ask is why. We know why. We know the deep temptation and the powerful forces at work, that drive that seems, especially in our teen years, like a powerful locomotive. And even if the drive wanes as we get older, it doesn't disappear. Even if a different temptation has been our drug of choice, it's not difficult to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagine if there had been just a few subtle changes of circumstance. Could that have been me? Or maybe more realistically, how long until I too am found out? Let's face it, gathered in this room this morning are several hundred people, all of whom are known sinners. Some of us have committed adultery. Others of us have struggled with pornography. A number of us have experienced the scars, the emotional pain left by our parents and friends and loved ones. And some suffer the pains of regret. We know firsthand the power of self-deception. And if this morning you find yourself confused and overwhelmed by these desires that are so deep within us, I want you to know you are not alone. If you long for healing from past mistakes, you need this sermon this morning. If you need a warning and a rebuke because you are breaking your vow to your spouse and your God, you need this lesson this morning. And if you don't know what you don't know about what makes unrealized desires and feelings so powerful, you need this sermon. And to help us see what we often fail to see, I want you to go back with me in your mind's eye to the old city of Jerusalem in the days of King David. I've got two excellent pictures I borrowed from Dale Manor, and it helps us realize what it looked like. The palace sat right at the top of the slope on one side, where you have a valley on one side, the Kidron Valley, and a narrow valley on the other side, houses lining both. And from the palace at the top of the slope, you could look out in either direction. And if you look down, you'd see the tops of roofs. In fact, depending on the angle, it would have been easy to see onto not just another roof, but you could look straight through and see into an uncurtained window of a house. The story, as Samuel tells it, is that David was resting on a couch before he arose to walk on the roof, and he saw a woman bathing. In that culture, in the heat of the day, People would have taken what you and I would call a siesta. And it's not surprising, it's fairly normal, that David will be sleeping on a couch on the roof where he gets to enjoy the breezes and the shade. And it's very normal that if you awake from a couch on the roof that you would take a walk and peruse and look around. The text says that he saw her bathing, and maybe she was bathing on a roof. Perhaps she was bathing in the privacy of your home in one of those uncurtained windows. For her to bathe and for him to see it, these could have both been innocent events. After all, this is a sermon about lust, and these stories always begin so innocent. There's nothing wrong with noticing beauty. Along with truth and goodness, beauty is one of the names for God. When we notice symmetry and lines and curvatures in a great work of art, or among the stars in the night sky, we don't feel guilty about that. We praise God for it. And when we see beauty in a person, we shouldn't be ashamed. Beauty is good. The attraction that one feels when you're drawn to beauty, even in a person, speaks to a good drive placed in us by God. And the text says that David saw her bathing, he saw her beauty, but I want you to notice that he saw something else. He saw an opportunity, one that wasn't his to take. You see, enjoying a work of art on display in a museum can give you goosebumps. Trying to steal it and take it home for yourself, that'll give you 10 years. But his mistake, his treachery, was more than just wanting to possess her, to steal her from Uriah and claim her. That's bad enough. He didn't see her. He saw an opening, a window, if you will, to his pleasure, his satisfaction, his inner desires. He saw an object to be used to placate his impulses. He saw it. Did he ever really see her? C.S. Lewis has a very vivid illustration. He says, can you imagine a culture where everybody gathers around as someone is holding a platter with a cover, and they're all hooping and hollering, ooh and awing as they slowly rise to reveal a plate full of bacon? You'd say something's wrong with this culture. They've got an inordinate, unwired right sense of food. And Lewis says, what do you think happens at a strip joint? What happens when we turn people into an object of our desire? And we turn something that's supposed to be loved and respected into an object of lust. Lust dehumanizes people. It has to. It doesn't work any other way. Why do you think exotic dancers use fake stage names? Because leering men don't want to know the real name. Peter Yonker says, you want to clear out the crowd at one of these places? Get up there and say, this is Sultry Susan, but her real name is Mary Walensky. She has 4 brothers and sisters. Her parents divorced when she was 5. Her mother's an alcoholic. She's been married twice. Her last husband beat her. She has 2 kids and is struggling to get by. She likes dogs and would love to be a dental hygienist someday. You'll clear out the room. Lust dehumanizes the other so often because it works to destroy covenants that require love and trust. Bathsheba was bathing, and David saw something he wanted. Bathsheba had something he wanted, but nothing he needed. He used her to satisfy his lust, and don't you believe for a second the lie that you can have cheap sex. There's no such thing. These stories don't end cheap. Lust is so very expensive. It cost David his judgment. It cost him his reputation, and there's more. The lust led to a lie, a cover-up, a murder, a prophetic announcement against him from God, and the death of a child. Bathsheba lost her husband and her son. Uriah lost his life. David lost all trust from his loyal subjects, and he lost a child as well, and he caused a rupture in his close relationship with God. How costly. Who would have thought that lust would have body counts? Lust can lead to betrayal and divorce, which is breaking your vows to do right by someone. It can lead to taking new vows, including ones full of lust and anger to do wrong by someone. And it can even lead to murder. We see all of that in David's story. And maybe Jesus has David in mind, or maybe somebody much closer to home in his own day, Herod Antipas. You remember Herod had lust for his brother's wife, and it led to betrayal of her oath of fidelity, and a new oath of wickedness, and finally murder of John the Baptist. So maybe you are thinking of David, maybe you're thinking of Herod. But now go back with me. When we think about that politician, or that player, that performer, or that preacher whose downfall came to mind at the beginning of the sermon, remember that for just a few changes of circumstance, that could have been me. Just that one innocent look, that one chance encounter, that simple flirtation. How were we to know what terrible things were to result? We didn't think twice when we were kids creating those ideal bodies in video games. We didn't blink once when we repeated those women-degrading lyrics in the song with the catchy beat. We never blushed once when we bought those romance novels lining our shelves, and we thought of those porn sites stuck in our history as none of your business. And what does it lead to? Men unable to deal with real things are now much less likely to date or marry. Women bearing the brunt of unrealistic expectations are now accommodating degrading behavior just to feel wanted. And because it sells, 4.8 million young people in our world are bought and sold as sensual slaves around the world, including 50,000 in our own country. But it all seemed so innocent. Innocent looks prove it so, but it only takes a spark to get a fire going. If David could travel back in time and speak to himself, what would he say? I know what he would say. He'd say 2 words: look away. Sarah had been married for 5 years, living in New York for 2. She took the metro train to work that day. She took the metro train to work every day. But on this day, a drop-dead gorgeous man walked through those doors and sat there, in her own words, being simply irresistible. Their eyes met, and then a warm smile that seemed to be shared by both slowly crept onto their faces. A conversation ensued until they both exited the train, all innocent enough. But Sarah began to get to the train stop a little early. She seemed to pay closer attention to her perfume and tended to sit near another open seat. After all, he wasn't just handsome. He listened. I mean, really listened. Not like her husband. He was drop-dead gorgeous, deeply interested in her life, and they met every day on the train. So of course she slept with him. What was she supposed to do? Her best friend gave her great advice, 2 words: change trains. It's what Jesus would say too. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. To appreciate Jesus' words, you've got to appreciate the power of hyperbole. We see it all throughout this whole chapter, and we know it intuitively. When Jesus says, whoever says you fool is in danger of hellfire, None of us think that that moment when we've actually used the words fool to describe someone, as the Bible does, that made us goners for sure. We know that when Jesus says, don't resist an evil person, that's got to be hyperbole. After all, we all lock our doors. We all say no to evil people. We've got a security team that's ready to, let's just say, resist. And we know that when he says, don't take oaths at all, we know he's got to mean it, and yet we have many people in this room who are Boy Scouts or do jury duty. We understand hyperbole. So when Jesus says, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, right hand, cut it off. He doesn't mean, I want this to be a room full of one-eyed Christians. He isn't literally calling us to cut off our hands. He's not redefining adultery. He's not giving us new law. You know what he's doing? He's giving us fresh eyes. Eyes to see what's really going on. Eyes to see ourselves and others in a brand new light, to see as God would see. And so Jesus offers us 3 challenges. The first, Jesus is challenging us to take our hearts seriously. In every line of our text this morning, Jesus is asking you a question. How seriously do you want to be like God? Jesus is going way beyond ethics, far beyond do's and don'ts. He's challenging the heart. When we ask God, where's the line, so I can get as close to it as possible without going over, he's questioning our question. If you want to be pure in heart, why do you care where the line is? The 10 Commandments were well known to everyone. Number 7 says, don't commit adultery. That was a sin that you could enforce. I mean, look, you know when you're committing adultery. Tim Keller has a great way to say this. He says, nobody starts to sleep with a woman and then suddenly says, wait a second, you're not my wife. We all know when we're committing adultery. And you know when others are committing adultery. It's a humanly enforceable offense. But then God gives a 10th commandment. You shall not covet. Now that has to do with what you desire, what you want to do. And he goes on to list other things that you could covet. For example, your neighbor's wife or what they have. But by the time of the first century, the Old Testament in Hebrew was translated into Greek. And when Jesus is speaking, the Bibles they would be reading were in Greek. And in the Greek text, the 10th commandment reads this way: don't covet your neighbor's wife. And the Greek word for covet is the same word Jesus uses here. Do you know what he's saying? You all know the 7th commandment. And you hold yourselves accountable to it. But don't you see? God has always cared about the desire that leads to the breaking of that commandment. What is unenforceable among humans is enforceable with God. And it ought to be self-enforced by people who want what God wants. It used to be that you didn't know if you broke it until you actually did something to prove it. Jesus says God knows what you want, and you know what you want. Behind every command, behind every iota and dot in the law stands a person, the one who made you, the one who loves you, a person with a heart. Read the words from God, but see the heart of God. If you can't see it, you're reading it wrong. When you face difficult situations, if your question is, what loophole, what footnote in the law gives me an out to follow the desires of my heart, you're reading it wrong. And if your question is, how can I make them change? You're reading it wrong. When God speaks, he speaks change to you. And that leads to our second challenge this morning. The second thing Jesus is doing is he's challenging us to take full responsibility. You see, the Pharisees reasoned that when it comes to a man's lust, it's a woman's wily ways that's to blame. Ancient Jewish texts spoke of men being ensnared by a woman's beauty. That language of being ensnared is meant to say that women set a trap and men happen to fall in it. And for this reason, A married Jewish woman was supposed to keep her head covered. And how much should be covered? Well, according to Sirach, a Jewish wisdom text, the haughty stare betrays an unchaste wife. Her eyelids give her away. But Jesus says none of that. If you want to preach a sermon on modesty, go right ahead, but this is not the text for it. Jesus doesn't mention it. And that's because if Jesus moved straight into what others should put on, he'd be doing a Pharisee move. One more rule about what we shall eat, what we shall drink, what we shall put on. No, Jesus is not talking about them. He's talking about us. Jesus puts the responsibility for lust squarely on my shoulders. For Jesus, this is not a sin of your ill-fitting head covering. This is a sin of my unspiritual heart. What does Paul say to the Thessalonians? He says, you were called to holiness. And for this reason, each of you should learn how to control his own body, rather than being caught up in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who don't know God, 1 Thessalonians 4. Your own body, not your neighbor's, your own. The third thing that Jesus is doing is he's challenging us to remember just what it is that we really want. Fear is not a lasting motivator. Avoid lust because it's wrong is not going to work very long. Instead, focus on what you really, truly, deep down want. Remember that first date? Oh, both of you are as nervous as can be. You're sitting at the movie theater, waiting to put your arm around her shoulder, and then wondering, what's she going to do? Am I going to get the cold, swift look of rejection? Or worse, is she going to stand up in mid-arm move and walk out of the theater? But she doesn't. In fact, she leans in and puts her head on your shoulder. That little move that sends shivers down your spine and a smile across your face. So wide you can see it from the moon. It says to each other, I invite you into a story much greater than you can even imagine, and you can trust me. And you can hold my hand as we begin this journey together. That's what we want. That's what we want. It's called intimacy, and we find it long before any physical union. In fact, if we don't find it there, we'll never find it later. Because the physical act isn't meant to satisfy. It's meant to express a connection that already exists, that already satisfies. When it takes place in a covenant of love, bound up with trust and accountability and facing the storms of life together, it becomes part of this beautiful story where every day, in every way, we reaffirm that we stand naked and unashamed before each other to face life together, come what may. Making love becomes a covenant renewal ceremony. Outside of that, feeding our lust is nothing more than takers and breakers, leaving vulnerable people even more vulnerable. And it starts with lust. Lust short circuits the whole story. It turns the other into an object to be used rather than a person to be loved. Sam Wells says one thing most of us never learn is that another person, fabulously beautiful or fun or interested in us as they may be, will never become that magical toy that fulfills all of our desires. When we meet an attractive person or spy them from the rooftop, that person becomes the vehicle onto which we project all of our desires. To be cynical, one could say that most relationships last as long as each partner can keep up the appearance of carrying the other one's projections. And that's expecting too much of a person. But it's also turning them into an instrument of your own fantasy. We've got to recognize that we do this all the time. We're constantly disappointed when people fail to fulfill the expectations that we've given them. A real relationship is based on learning to love the real person once the fantasy has disintegrated. During my senior year of college, John Mayer wrote and sang, "Your body is a wonderland." He didn't see the body as a work of art to be appreciated. He saw it as an amusement park to be used. And just like an amusement park, after the thrill's gone, we can leave everyone and everything behind, right along with our trash and our sweat on the vinyl seats. But what if a body is not a place for cheap thrills, but a sacred space? A chance to get to know the real you. In her poem, To a Long-Loved Love, Madeleine Langlais writes, "Because you're not what I would have you be, I blind myself to who in truth you are. Seeking mirage where desert blooms, I mar your you. I would like to see past all delusion to reality. Then would I see God's image in your face, his hand in yours, and in your eyes, his grace." Why do you think that studies continue to show that living together before marriage doesn't make it more likely that you'll stay together? It makes it less likely. You know why. Because doing that turns every night together into a never-ending audition. How about lust? Do you know why lust isn't enough, why you have to keep feeding it? Do you know why soft porn isn't enough? It always leads to more progressive sin. It only gets worse and worse because it doesn't actually feed anything. It's chewing air and only starving more. And when we really want to feel fulfilled in our own lives, we want to do something meaningful and we want to be meaningful to someone else. That only happens in real, loving, trusting relationships. In closing, let me say three things. First, to the disciple who wants their heart to beat in lockstep with Jesus Christ, if you want to quit dehumanizing your brothers and sisters and setting a whole course on fire, take lust as seriously as you take what comes after. And change trains. Take a cold shower. Exit the rooftop. Cut off the 5G. It may be better for you to enter into marriage with no phone or laptop than the alternative. Second, to the disciple of Jesus Christ who's broken covenant with their eyes, with their body, with their heart, those who've lusted after others or committed adultery or otherwise broken your vow of purity in your heart, you can find hope and renewal in the Lord. When we come to him, we don't find a cold stone tablet with etchings pronouncing our guilt. We find a person who knows every bit what it's like to be human, who sympathizes with our weakness and says, "I knew you were going to face this temptation when I called you, and I'm not going anywhere." And finally, to anyone in this room who feels betrayed by your partner's wandering eye or philandering ways, hear the high calling of this message from a God who keeps his commitments even when we do not. God knows and understands the pain you're going through. It feels overwhelming. It seems irredeemable, but my God majors in irredeemable things. Your partner's unfaithfulness is not the only thing that's true about them, just as your mistakes in life is not the only thing true about you. In our relationships, God is the only one who always remains truly faithful. And he comes to us every day and he renews his vows. For the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Truly great is his faithfulness. Believe in the gospel of repentance and renewal. And as God gives you strength, seek to forgive the inexcusable as God forgives the inexcusable in us. And let us be a generation that is different. Let us see what God sees and look as God looks. Let our eyes and our hearts be as pure as our bodies, and let us make that commitment today.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been enriched. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, reach out to us at prayers@wschurch.net. God bless you. Tune in next week.